Next thing I want to cover is how to change text inline. In the assignment description, it also gives one of the parameters as using a class selector. So let's do that now. When would you use this? So a class selector is when you want to add some styling to a class and then be able to give that class to multiple selectors no matter what they are, and be able to use it throughout your website. So for example, let's say this word here, jelly bean. And because my content is repeating using lorem ipsum or kitten ipsum, I have jelly bean in each of these paragraphs. So let's say that there is a word in your paragraph that you want to style separate from the parent paragraph element. For that, there's a couple of steps. First, let's go ahead and style that class. So a class selector. So far, we've only used element selectors. The element selectors, we only needed the name of the element we wanted to target in our HTML, and then that styling targets every instance of that element. If you only have one of those elements, it just does it to that one element. But like sections or articles, we had multiple instances of that element, and they were all affected by the element selector. So in a case where you don't want it to affect everything, so this paragraph of text, I want one word to be different than the rest of that paragraph, so I cannot use an element selector. From there, you ask, do I then want this styling I'm about to create to affect different elements, a lot of different elements? I want to be able to use it multiple times. If so, then your choice is the class selector. And that's what we want to use right now. So the class selector begins with a period. Then the name that you assign to it using the class attribute in your HTML. That'll make a little more sense here in just a second. First, I'll just go ahead and name it. So a period, and then I'm going to call this orange bold text. I'm being descriptive with this class selector. Just by reading that, you can now see that I'm going to make this text orange and bold. So let's do that. My font dash color, I want to be this orange color that I gave the background, which I'm actually going to get rid of that in a minute, but I'm going to copy that color for now, or you could go over to your color theme and grab it. And I want it to be bold. So font dash, this is weight. The weight has to come from your Google Fonts. If you didn't add that into your Google Font link, then that weight won't work. So you gotta kind of remember what you used. If you don't remember, you can go back over to your HTML, look at your link, and I can see here, my Open Sans, I have all these different font weights that I could use, 300, 700, or 800. So back over my style, here with my font weight, I'm going to use the most bold, so I'll go with 800. So first I want to give this an orange color, so just color. And I'm pasting in that orange color. You could, of course, choose whatever color you want. I want to change the font weight. So font dash weight. This is to make it bolder or lighter, depending on what you want to do. But this is always determined by what you added into your Google font when you created the link. if you're using Google Fonts. So, for example, I am. So I can go back here to my HTML and scroll up to my link, and I can see here the weights that I included. I included a 300, a 700, and an 800. So those are the ones that I can use. That's troubleshooting. If you make that font weight change and you're not seeing it change, you might be using the wrong weight that you don't actually have included with your font. I'm going to go with my bolder font, which was 800. And we're not seeing anything happen yet. We're just creating that class. That class we can now give to any element that we want in our HTML. So I'm going to bounce back over to my HTML, and let's say I'm going to give that to my H1. If I do want to give it to a block level element, I go inside that opening tag, I add in the attribute of class, then equals quotation, and then the name that I have in my CSS, which is orange bold text. That in here, minus the hash sign, needs to be exactly what is in your CSS. No matter which one you write first, you could give the class attribute first and then create the class selector in your CSS. Doesn't matter as long as that is the exact same. The hash is in the CSS, it is not in your HTML. One thing I want to point out really quick is how I'm writing this. With naming your selectors, there's a set of rules. They have to be all lowercase with the beginning letter. You can capitalize as long as it is not the beginning letter. So here where I have the O is smaller case. If I capitalized it, it would not work. It cannot be capital. But I have capitalized the B here and the T here. This is called camelbacking. It basically allows you to visually see separate words. You don't have to do it, but you can, as long as that very first letter is not capital. The first letter also, you don't want it to be a number, but as long as it's not that first character, you can have numbers later. The whole thing, you don't want any spaces, and you don't want to add any weird characters. So I can use numbers and letters, but I don't want to use any symbols. I don't want to use especially symbols that are code. So no angle brackets, no curly braces, nothing like that. That'll mess it up and it won't understand. All right, so here that I have my H1 with the class attribute, and then it links to the name of that attribute over my CSS. I'm gonna bounce back over there so I can take a look. It's exactly the same here. Oh, sorry, I was saying hash. We're working with class, that's a period. And now if I look at my H1, I have this bold orange text. However, I actually don't want that. So I'm gonna go back to my HTML and take that class away from my H1. And I'm going to reuse it. So I'm actually just gonna Command C and copy it, or Command X, which copies it and deletes it, because I wanna add it to the word jelly beans in each of my paragraphs. So if I come down here and I find that word jelly bean, I want to style that separate from the parent element, which is paragraph. To do that, I have to include another tag. I need to include a generic inline tag called span. Span has no semantic meaning. It doesn't add anything extra. It just allows you to apply attributes to text in a situation like this. So here I'm going to go ahead and take that closing span tag and make sure that it's at the very end of that word. So I have now separated out this word jelly bean with that tag span. And then I can apply that class to this span tag. Whoop. I had copied that class and then I deleted it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, minus the period, and I'm going to paste it in here and add my class attribute. So class equals quotation, orange bold text. Notice how it's broken. All of that text is orange, and that's because I need to add in my closing quotation. And if I look over here, I can see I have jelly bean, and it is now different than that whole paragraph. And if I wanted to do all those jelly bean words in each of those separate paragraphs, I'm going to just copy that, find jelly bean down here, and do the same thing to it. I'm just copying and pasting, but I could add that span with the class equal to orange bold text. One last one down here, here's jelly bean, and I'm going to go ahead and add that in. So I can see over here in my preview, each of those jelly bean words takes on that styling. Don't forget all the different things you could do. So maybe I want to add a little bit more. I'm going to bring this over so we can watch. Maybe I want to also add a strike through. So I could do font dash, actually this is not font. I have text dash decoration. If you want to underline or overline something, this is how you would do it, but you can also line through. So if I look a little bit closer over at my preview, I'll zoom in so you can see, it now takes on that line through. So whatever text formatting or styling that I want to add in, I can. Next, we need to go ahead and use what's called an ID selector. So we talked about an element selector, a class selector, and now an ID selector. So if there is something that you need to do to only one element throughout your entire website, only one individual element, and I don't mean the instances of one element. We saw that with section or, article. But what if there is amongst the sections one section that I want to style different? To do that, I could use an ID selector. So let's go ahead just for fun and throw a border around the second section that houses the images. So for that, I'm going to go back to my CSS. And well, last time when we built the class, we did that in our CSS first and then added the attribute in our HTML. Let's do opposite. So over in your HTML, find your second section that houses the images, go inside that opening section tag and add the attribute of ID equals quotation, and then name it. I'm going to call this images. Then I'll use that name over in my CSS. I'm going to go ahead and save my HTML. And the ID selector begins with a hash and then the name that you gave it. So images. Then you go ahead and add what you want. I said we are going to add a border. Let's go ahead and do like our dotted over on the other, the H2. So 2 pixels, solid, dotted, and black. Okay, so that allowed us to add that border around just one section, not them both, like would have happened if it was the element selector. I could have added this as a class selector. I could have. You usually just use the ID selector when there's just one particular thing you want to style, or to just give an ID to an element over in your HTML to make it more readable. For example, if I had 7 sections, I might want to just go ahead and add the ID attribute to each of them and call them section, ID equals section 1, ID equals section 2, ID equals section 3. So even if I'm not using the ID to style in my CSS, I can still use that that ID attribute in my HTML to distinguish between the sections for my own readability. So you can use it in a couple different ways. The ID selector is probably the least used of the three. The element selector is used the most, and then the class selector following, and the ID selector, not as much, but you still do use it. All right, we saw something that happened that's an issue when we added that border. So remember that border adds to the overall size of the element. So I now see that the two sections with their padding and border are too large to sit on the same line. So I'm going to go back up to, and I could do this numerous different ways. I could change the size of the border, I could change the size of padding, or I could change the size of those sections. I'm going to go ahead and do this section. So here where I had the width at 45, I'm going to go ahead and start to bring that back down until they fit on the same line, but I don't have a ton of extra room. So I'll keep adding until it breaks and then bring it back up. So maybe 44.5 or 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9. We're gonna have to just do 44.9. 45 pushed us over, we already know that, so 44.9 is gonna be where we're at. So let me move my cursor, bounce over here to our example, and now we can see we were able to style that section separate from the other section using an ID selector. Once again, the ID selector, you only give that name, so for us that was images, you can only use that one time throughout your entire website. Once you've given something an ID, never use that ID again in the same website. All right, we're almost done. Just one last thing I want to point out, and that is the orange border that we see, even though we set our header, main, and footer to 100%, and our body we didn't give any width or height, which means it is following browser defaults, which is 100%. So even though everything is set to 100%, why is it not 100%? I'm seeing this orange. It doesn't go all the way over. That is because of browser defaults. And if you don't override browser defaults, they remain. And browser defaults for some elements adds margin and padding. So if you don't want that to happen and you want to make sure it doesn't happen to anything, let's say I did not want that orange border, that I don't want to see the body back there, there is the selector. I'm going to come back here all the way to the top. You usually do this at the very top of your CSS. It doesn't matter, it's just to keep me organized, but I'm going to go ahead and place it up here since it is going to reference all elements. So the selector is star. Open my curly braces. The star means all elements, everything. I want to give this styling to everything. So if I want to override my browser defaults, let's say margin, I don't want any to be applied by browser default. I only want what I've applied in my code. Then I set my margin here to 0. That already took care of my orange border, but because it can be different in different browsers, I'm also going to do that to my padding. So padding 0. I'm gonna, save my style CSS. I'm gonna save my HTML. It's a good idea to make that a habit to just constantly do that. And if I look over at my preview, I can see that orange border is now gone. If I scroll too far, I'm scrolling here, I can see that orange back there. If I do that at the bottom, I see that as well. That's because the body still has that orange color on it. It's just that I've stretched everything out to 100%, now overriding those browser defaults that are giving margin and padding to those block level elements. I can also see one last thing here. I don't like that this border is touching this article. So I need to add margin. I need to push those two apart. Not inside either of those elements, but between them. So not padding, margin. So back over my CSS, I can go and find my H2, and I could either add margin to the bottom of my H2, or I could add margin to the top of my articles. If I did that, however, it would add it to each of my articles. So the best thing here to do would be to add margin to the bottom of this H2. So I find that selector, my CSS, and I go ahead and add that in. Margin dash bottom. And I'll do for, actually, because this is up and down, I don't want to use percentage. I'm going to go ahead and do 20 pixels. Back over my preview and moving my cursor so I don't have that blue. That's much better. One of those little details that you always want to watch out for. And if I pull my browser out a little bit now that I've added some more, I can get these lined up a bit. Again, not perfect, doesn't matter for this. We'll learn how to do that later, but we're looking pretty good. I'm now ready to go ahead and make sure that all those files are saved, compress that project folder. The assignment description is going to tell you to rename it because right now, sorry, I pushed save on that. Because right now it is still named demo, so you need to make sure that you rename the project folder your last name, first initial, and then the project number. Then compress it and turn in just that zipped or compressed file on D2L.